activating or reticular formation. Part of those structures are found in the medulla, and they're the respiratory center and the cardiovascular center. So I'm just going to write them in here. You don't have to know the actual location. They have to do with the nuclei of our cranial nerve. So we're going to have the respiratory center and the cardiovascular center. So the cardiovascular center, let's say that you stand up. And when you stand up, sometimes you get a little faint, things get a little gray, all right? It's called orthostatic hypotension. And I know one time I had some outpatient surgery when I was a graduate student, and I came home. Outpatient means you don't spend the night, they just do it in the doctor's office or whatever. And I came home, and I was sitting on my couch, came back to my apartment in Davis, and I got up to go to the kitchen, and when we're talking like from here to that wall, the one-bedroom apartment, and I got to the kitchen counter, and things started to go a little gray. And so I bent my head over like this to get a little bit more blood back to my head. And the next thing I knew, I was waking up, and I was face down on the kitchen floor. I remember thinking, why did I decide to fall asleep out here? And my shoulder hurt. And when I got up, I had the kitchen drawer was partly out, and I had fallen on the drawer and broken the face part of the drawer off. That had flipped me over, and I had landed face down on the kitchen floor. Low blood pressure, all right? Typically what happens is when you stand up, cardiovascular response to the low blood pressure is to get your heart rate going and cause the blood vessels to constrict. Okay, that's an autonomic response. If blood pressure is too high, cardiovascular center will cause your heart rate to drop and will dilate blood vessels. All right, in a typical homeostasis response. Part of the autonomic nervous system control that we'll talk about through the hypothalamus in our next unit. Respiratory center. Cardiac muscle is autonomic, right? Respiratory muscle. Are you using voluntary or involuntary muscles when you breathe?
Involuntary.
Stop breathing. Don't take a breath. Can you do that with your heart? No, you can't stop your heart for even 10 seconds, okay? So breathing is voluntary but driven by a reflex based on the amount of carbon dioxide in your blood. That's why you can fall asleep and still keep breathing. So that normal pattern of breathing is set by the respiratory center. If you hold your breath, what's going to eventually drive you? You can't hold your breath forever until you die, okay? Because you'll eventually be driven to take a breath by the increase of CO2 levels. So from the respiratory center, there is connections. There are nerve fibers that connect down to your spinal cord to the nerves that go to your diaphragm and your intercostal muscles. So if we cut between the medulla and the spinal cord, you will die because you will not breathe. There will be no upper motor neurons from either your cortex or your medulla connecting with your diaphragm and your intercostal muscles. Okay? If we cut between the medulla and the pons, you will now breathe. You won't be able to think or move your other muscles, but you'll be able to breathe because there will be fibers going from the medulla to your diaphragm making it move. You won't be able to move your hands because you won't have voluntarily because you won't have your precentral gyrus, but your breathing muscles will work. Okay? It will be a ragged pattern because the pons isn't working, but you will respond to changes in CO2 level. Okay? So you will be able to still get the diaphragm to work for that. So that's what's talking about in those areas. Now the motor pathways, the sensory and motor tracts that are listed on page 96 or on any of the other brainstem structures, that's what we're going to talk about on Friday and Tuesday of next week. Okay, so I have them listed here so you have all the information together, but I'm not going to describe them. So this is one of the sensory pathways, and the motor pathway. But we're going to go over that. I just have them here together in this grouping. Okay? And the cranial nerves will start today and finish on Thursday. So I just wanted to pull them all together in one area of your lecture notes. But these are the structures that we're going to go through. So on a lecture exam, if I say which of all of the following structures or components of the medulla except, and I say pyramid and fourth ventricle, all right, and nucleus cuneatus. Those would all be structures that you would associate with the medulla. Okay? Function. Which of the following components of the brain controls the reflex for breathing, or sets the normal rhythm pattern for breathing? That would be respiratory center in the medulla. Okay? So that's kind of how we'll look at that, and then we'll pick up these other components as we get to the Friday and Tuesday's lectures. All right, now let's look at the pons. Pons means bridge. So this is bridging the medulla and the midbrain of the pons. And the ventral view of the pons shows this large section here, which is like a belly. Remember we talked about the basilar artery? It gets its name from the basal pons. So the basal pons is that large ventral swelling. Now, here are these same upper motor neurons that I drew coming down from the precentral gyrus through the pons, forming the medullary pyramids. And so they're going to pass through the pons, but notice the difference in size. Notice how large these motor fiber bundles in the midbrain are compared to these motor fiber bundles in the pyramid. They're 2 or 3 times the size. So something has happened to these descending motor fibers. Not all of them go into the pyramid. And so what happens is some of them stop. A lot of them stop. They come down to the pons and they stop. And they form a synapse with the cell bodies of neurons that do not continue downward. These neurons leave the pons and go out to the cerebellum. All right, so in the medulla, remember the inferior cerebellar peduncle? Those were ascending fibers. And so those ascending fibers came up and went to the pons. And they form the inferior cerebellar peduncle.
Are they ascending fibers, projection fibers too?
Yes. They don't ascend all the way to the brain, but they're still projection fibers. So that's the inferior cerebellar peduncle, part of the medulla. These would be the middle cerebellar peduncle. And I'll draw a cross-section of the pons in a moment. So on our diagram, middle cerebellar peduncle is shown as these fibers leaving right here. And in the posterior view, this would be inferior cerebellar peduncle here. It's about the width of a fingernail. And this is middle. So we haven't talked about the cerebellum yet. By the time we actually get to it, you'll understand its function. So ascending fibers going to the cerebellum are going to tell the cerebellum, using an anthropomorphic term, they're going to send a signal to the cerebellum, making it aware of what position your joints are in. Okay? You can't say so. So if my brainstem was cut above the pons, my cortex would have no awareness of those joints, all right? But my cerebellum would. So that sensory information coming up through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Descending information coming from the precentral gyrus is sending information to my motor neurons. So if I want to move out and pick up this red pen, all right, I'm sending a signal down through my brain, through my medullary pyramids, down the spinal column to my anterior gray horn. That goes out to my arm and says, reach out, which muscles need to extend, which muscles need to flex so I can pick up this pen. However, not all of those fibers carrying that kind of information are going to go down the spinal cord. So we'll stop, and they will send that same information to the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is getting information about what I'm going to do. So it knows where my arm is. It knows whether my arm is flexed or extended. And it knows what I'm going to do next. Am I going to continue to extend it, or am I going to flex it more? And that's what these descending fibers are doing, going out to the cerebellum, sharing that proposed, intended motor movement. So the reason the cerebellum is so large is because of these nuclei. And these are known as pontine nuclei. And that's what makes the basal pons so large. So on a posterior view, we don't see much except the middle cerebellar peduncle and the floor of the fourth ventricle. Up here, the floor of the fourth ventricle. So here's the basal pons, middle cerebellar peduncle, basal pons. Here's the middle cerebellar peduncle, and just this little piece down here is the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So middle cerebellar peduncle, and down here would be the inferior. Okay? It's not hard to even mark on the model. And most of the fourth ventricle associated with the pons. So here's a transverse section. You really appreciate the beer belly here. Sensory pathways are going to continue to pass up through the pons. Here's our fourth ventricle again. And the cerebellum is going over it. We would have the pontine nuclei. Cell bodies of fibers that are going out the middle cerebellar peduncle. And the descending fibers are just going to go right on through. Okay. And same thing here. So on Friday, I'll name some of the sensory pathways going through, but we do have some cranial nerve nuclei in the floor of the fourth ventricle here. That's what these structures are showing here. Here's the trigeminal nerve. Has its cell bodies, its lower motor neurons are in the pons. So these are the lower motor neurons for the trigeminal nerve that comes out of the pons. So the pons also has a respiratory component. It adjusts the rhythm. So if we cut below the medulla, no breathing. If we cut between the medulla and the pons, there is breathing, but it's irregular. If we cut between the pons and the midbrain, we have a normal breathing pattern. Okay? So it modulates the breathing, but you can breathe without it. So these are known as the apneustic and pneumotaxic respiratory centers. Not necessary for life. But there's not a cardiovascular component. Pathways we'll just look at on Friday. Okay, now we're ready for the midbrain. The midbrain is right inferior to the diencephalon. It has some more interesting external structures. So we're kind of working backwards for our our motor structures. So here's the upper motor neurons coming down into the pons. And here would be the mammillary body of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And on either side of those, all of these motor structures are forming a cerebral peduncle. Not cerebellar, but cerebral peduncle. And that is this structure right here. Okay? So the motor fibers from the precentral gyrus form the cerebral peduncle. Many of them will pass through the pons. Some of them will stay behind, synapsing with the pontine nuclei. The others will continue to form the pyramid, cross over to the opposite side in the pyramidal decussation, and then go down the spinal cord. Okay? So all of those are the same motor fibers. Again, ventral. Right? So the cerebral peduncles are a ventral structure of the midbrain. If we cut the cerebral peduncle, would you be paralyzed on the same side or the opposite side of the body as the cerebral peduncle?
Opposite.
Excellent. Opposite, because it hasn't yet crossed over. Very good. All right, now let's look at a cross section of the, well, let's look at the door.